Hello and a warm welcome to today's first A-Level history presentation. Your presenters of the A-Level sessions are myself, Miss Karen Thomas, and Mr. Andrew Morell. Today's session will be delivered by Mr. Morell, so without further ado, over to you, Andrew, for today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Ms. Thomas, much appreciated. Yeah, we are both really looking forward to over the next 4 weeks helping to give you a good outline of the History A-Level course in order to best help you when it comes then to that gathering evidence for the end of year 13. So to begin with, just a timetable of what we're going to be doing over the next 4 weeks. So obviously today is the first session, and we're going to be looking today specifically at Unit 3 and how, even more specifically, to manage the thematic content. And the way we're going to do that is focusing on the key concepts in the Unit 3. Next week then, session 2, same time on the Tuesday as well, we're going to be looking at essay writing, so the skills then associated with the assessment and focusing on developing reasoned arguments. And then the next 2 sessions then will be led by Miss Thomas, so again on Tuesdays between 4:30 and 5:10, the 2 Tuesdays following that, and Miss Thomas is going to focus on Unit 4. So the first session then, Unit 4, will be an overview of Unit 4 and a focus specifically on question 1. And then the second session with Ms. Thomas on the 23rd of March will be focusing on question 2 and question 3, those skills and requirements of it, as well as a bit of a refresh then of question 1 as well. So over these next 4 weeks, you'll get a good outline of both Unit 3 and Unit 4 then in the build-up for when you return to school or college, and then in the readiness for gathering that evidence for your grades at the end of a 2-year course. So as I said then, I'm going to be focusing on Unit 3. I teach Unit 3 here in Llanidloes High School, and today then we'll focus on how to manage thematic content and to focus on those key concepts. And we'll have roughly a 30-minute discussion / presentation from me about how to manage that content. And then at the end, there'll be a roughly 10-minute slot for questions and answers. So in the top right-hand side of your screen, there is a little bar with different things. Probably if you use Teams for school or sixth form college anyway, you'll be used to this. It's got a chat function, show participants, etc. There'll also be a little question mark inside a kind of a square speech bubble. In there, then you can ask questions. You're more than welcome to ask them as we go along, and I'll address any at the end, or just ask them at the end. And then in that roughly 10-minute time slot, then I'll take those questions and we can discuss anything, anything in particular you want to bring out, or anything that you're not sure about, or anything maybe more generally to do with Unit 3 as well. So Unit 3 covers a large variety of different topics, okay, and that's really the importance of why myself and Ms. Thomas are going to focus on the skills really, because the content we couldn't possibly cover it all in 4 sessions. Between all the 10 options at Unit 3 and 8 options at Unit 4, it just wouldn't be possible. But hopefully one of these topics then are a topic that you will be studying currently in your sixth form college or sixth form in a school. So that could be Wales Resistance, Conquest and Rebellion. Could be Poverty, Protest and Rebellion in Wales and England. It could be Reformation and Discovery in Europe, 1492 to 1610. It could be Royalty, Revolution and Restoration in Wales and England. It could be the Ancien Regime to Napoleon in France. Could be Parliamentary Reform and Protest in Wales and England. Could be Social Change and Reform in Wales and England, 1819 to 1990, quite one of those modern ones. Similar then in the American Century, 1890 to 1990, very modern. Or it could be Changing Leadership in Society in Germany, or Changing Leadership and Society in Russia. One of those is what you'll be studying. Now, a bit of a confession to start with, right? I teach and my passion lies in the American Century. So I'm afraid my knowledge won't be as great on these other topics, but nevertheless, the ideas behind the content and the concepts apply equally across all these 10 options, as the same as that assessment will do at the end. The skills are the same. It doesn't matter if you're doing the American Century, like I teach here in Llanidloes, or whether it is one of these other options like Changing Leadership and Society in Russia. Now, what I've tried to do is I'm trying to fish out and use examples from all 10 of these different options So hopefully, even though the content we won't be covering, hopefully then you'll still see that it's relevant to the specific topic you're studying, and it is relevant to the setting where you are, whether that's in your school or sixth form college, across Wales, wherever it is you are. So in terms of content, Unit 3 covers a period of at least 100 years. Now, you'll have seen in some of those topics previously that actually some of them cover more than 100 years. And within that, they focus on two specific themes. And therefore, it's quite common for Year 13s, right, to say for about Unit 3 and in fact about Unit 1 as well, that they are very content heavy. Right? I get a lot of my Year 13s and my Year 12s say, there's a lot to know, sir. And they're absolutely right. There is a lot to know, but there's a way that we can manage that. Because the crucial element in here is that it is a breadth, not a depth study. So you don't need to know that content in as much detail as you do for Unit 2 or Unit 4. They're much shorter time periods for those, and so you need to know them in greater depth. But for this at least 100-year time period, you can't be expected to know it in as much depth. So if you're at home thinking, I don't know certain elements of Unit 3 in as much depth as Unit 2 or Unit 4, then that is natural. That's going to happen anyway. And it's recommended by the exam board and by us as teachers as well, that instead you take a more general overview of the important individuals, events, terms and dates that are essential to understanding each theme or smaller issue within your option. And we'll go through today about how we focus our attention on those things, the individuals, events, terms, dates. And it's vital, incredibly important, that your period 3 study you look at as a whole. You don't take it individually, you look at it as a whole and you do things that bring it together as a whole. And so you should, where you can, make links and connections between and across different features and characteristics across the whole time period. Again, I'll give you activities, suggested tasks at the end of the day that might be able to help you with that as well. So how do you manage the content of Unit 3, which at first appears to be so huge? Well, my firm suggestion and what we're going to work through today is focusing on those key concepts: cause and consequence, significant individuals, turning points, similarity and difference, and change and continuity. This is how the specification is framed, and this is how I then recommend we tackle any content in that at least 100-year time period, and we narrow it down so that it's not too big a burden, that content. So we'll start with cause and consequence. Well, what do I mean by cause and consequence? Well, cause is what made this event happen in the first place, and consequence is what was the result of it. So in an example, hopefully you're all aware of, if you've not, I don't know where you were at the weekend, but the event, for example, Wales winning against England in the Six Nations on Saturday. Now the cause, what could it be? Well, it could have been that controversial knock-on try by Liam Williams. The consequence of it, well, that could be that Wales took the Triple Crown, or it could be that continued banter between the English and the Welsh as well. Now, unfortunately, right, A-level history is not quite as simple as that. There is going to be greater complexity, but the very principle applies the same. So in terms of causes, then we need to look at short-term and long-term causes. And what were the significant and insignificant causes? What were the main causes? What were less important? When it comes to consequences, again, short-term and long-term consequences, as well as positive and negative consequences. So an example then from option 1, right? A specific thing mentioned in the specification, the content for option 1, is you'd need to know the effects of the Black Death in Wales. Now you might be sat there thinking, or you might have been when you learned it in lessons, that you need to know every single detail there is then to know about the Black Death in Wales. That's not quite right. It's a cause and a consequence feature, and that is what you need to focus on. So in terms of the cause, how did the Black Death spread within Wales? Was it through those port towns of Carmarthen and Pembroke and the role of the customs officials? Or was it instead, as they believed at the time, the manifestation of evil, right? People being struck down at Black Death because they'd done evil things in the first place. So it's looking at the causes of it. And then in terms of the consequences of the effects of the Black Death, well, were the economic hardships of less people to till the land, more or less significant than the fewer monks that were about to sustain the importance of the church within Wales. Things you'd have come across if you were doing option 1. So again, you're not looking at the entirety of the Black Death, you're not looking at everything to do with the Black Death. You're looking at the causes and the more significant causes, and then the consequences, whether they're short-term, long-term, positive and negative consequences as well. So an essay question, and you'll see these pop up in the bottom as we take each key concept. An essay question that would be really, that kind of speaks to this, is this one from option 2, which asks the most significant cause of poverty and vagrancy in the period 1509 to 1553 was enclosure. Discuss. 30 mark as they usually are. So you can see that that's looking specifically for you to look at causes. And so by breaking that content down into those key concepts of cause and consequence, it could help you. Our second key concept is the idea of significant individuals. And by this we mean, how important is that individual in comparison to others working on similar things? An example we can use from present day, something's in the news, something that again would be very hard to have missed, is Boris Johnson's handling of COVID-19. So in order to ask ourselves, is he a significant individual in this? We need to think, is he more significant to the handling of the pandemic than the scientists are? Or is he more significant than other leaders of UK nations? Mark Drakeford in Wales, Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland, Arlene Foster in Northern Ireland. So in order to understand the significance of Boris Johnson, we need to make sure we're doing some sort of comparisons. And again, of course, it isn't quite that simple in our history A level, but the basis is the same. We need to compare an individual's role in similar, not the same. We're never going to have exactly the same circumstances, but compare an individual's role in similar circumstances and how significant their impact then was in reality. So if we take another example from another option unit, Peter Stolypin is specifically mentioned in option 10. And so again, we don't need to know every single detail there is about Peter Stolypin. What we need to know instead is how significant he was. So we're asking questions then like, did Stolypin's policies of reform and repression have that big an impact in reality? Were Stolypin's actions better placed to secure government authority than people like Lavrenti Beria later in the 1950s? So by asking these sorts of questions and focusing on their significance, we break this content down, we realise we don't need to know everything there is to possibly know about Peter Stolypin, for example. Example of an essay question that taps into this from Unit 3. How far was John Calvin the most significant influence on the spread of Protestantism between 1521 and 1559? So again, it shows you don't need to know everything there is to possibly know about John Calvin. I'm not even sure historians would know that there's, I'm not even sure historians would know everything there is to know about him, but it's about his role, it's about his significance as an individual on the wider topic that you're studying. Another key concept is turning points. So in terms of turning points, we're asking how fundamental was the change brought by this event? And is it fair to say that change was permanent because of its long-term impact? Now, one I'm sure you're all hot on, right? Event, One Direction, splitting up. People may argue it's a turning point because it fundamentally changed pop music in the UK. Think, for example, would we have Watermelon Sugar without One Direction splitting up? Some people may argue that it's a fundamental change and things after it are very, very different. Now, again, no surprise, history A level is a bit more complex, but the basis, that idea of a turning point is the same and applies across our content. So turning points need to reference whether or not the change has a sizable impact in the long term. In order for us to call it a turning point, we need to know that it fundamentally changes what happens. So an example I teach, the Cuban Missile Crisis in option 8, it is considered a turning point with regard to foreign policy in America. And so we need to ask kinds of questions along the lines of, was this near nuclear disaster really enough to be the event that ended that concept of mutually assured destruction? We need to analyse whether or to what extent this was a turning point. How long-term and sizable were the changes in how the USA and USSR dealt with each other by establishing that hotline between the two? Is it a fundamental change in how these countries interacted? So again, we don't need to know everything there is to know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is about knowing whether or not we can consider it as a true turning point or not. So an essay example, right, an essay question you might get on this with regard to option 3 could be, how far do you agree that the publication of Martin Luther's 95 Theses was the major turning point in religion in the period 1500 to 1600? It's asking you to look at that specific thing, specific event, and to suggest whether or not it is a turning point. Does it fundamentally change what we've seen from before? Another key concept is similarity and difference. In terms of similarity, we're thinking how similar, how alike is this event to another event that we've seen? When it comes to difference, how different or contrasting is the event to another one that we've seen, another one you've studied in your particular topic? So, an example we might be aware of, okay, the anticipated release of No Time to Die. What's the similarity? We can look for similarities here. We can compare that anticipated release of No Time to Die to other James Bond films, what things are alike, the media reporting on it, the build-up, the anticipation. But we can also look at the difference, contrast this anticipated release to other releases. What differs? Well, the thing that jumps out, if nothing else, is that No Time to Die has been, which release has been put back at least twice so far. So to exemplify similarity and difference, we can think of it like that. One event, what's similar to another event that's similar to it, and what's different to another event that's similar to it as well. You can predict what I'm going to say next. Of course, it isn't quite as simple as this in your history A level, but nonetheless, those greater complexities added onto this help us to understand similarity and difference, and that we don't need to know every single bit of the content. So similarity and difference, it compares and it contrasts the impact, the success, the attitudes of something across both time and regions. Now those last 3 words are really important there. You might be asked to think about a similarity and difference across time. To what extent has something changed over the 100-year period? But equally, you might be asked to compare it, the similarity and difference, across different regions. So for my example with the American century, looking at civil rights in America, we definitely compare what it was like for Black African Americans in the South of America in comparison to the North of America. We look for those similarities and those differences. So an example from Unit 3, or Option 3, sorry, within Unit 3, could be, this is taken absolutely word for word from the specification, the content, support for the Catholic Church in Spain, Portugal, and the Italian states. So if you were to read that at first, you'd think, I need to know everything there is to know about the support for the Catholic Church in these 3 countries. But when we break it down and we see that it's in that similarity and difference category, that's when we start to break it down and understand that it's not too much content. Instead, we're thinking about, how did the support for the church differ across the countries of Spain, Portugal, and Italy? How did the support within these countries change over time? You can see that example there, can't you, of it changing over time and across regions. Is there something similar in the support for the church across these countries? Something that unites them together? Are there differences in support for the church within one of these countries? So important to remember it's across both time and regions as well. So another essay question that kind of exemplifies this and shows you that the focus on these key concepts will benefit you significantly when it comes to answering any essay questions is this from option 7, which says, or which asks, the reform of the Liberal governments 1906 to 1914 were the most effective attempt at tackling the problem of poverty in the period 1890 to 1990. So it's specifically asking you to compare or to look at the similarity and difference to how governments and reforms have dealt with that poverty, or that issue of poverty, across that whole 100-year time period. So again, you wouldn't need to know everything that there is to know about problems of poverty across that whole 100-year time period is more about looking for the similarities and differences in how the government tackled it. Looking for how that government, the similarity between how that government tackled it and how other governments tackled it, and the differences between those tacklings of the issue as well. Lastly then, change and continuity, our final key concept. Change refers to how a trend develops over time, whilst continuity instead looks at how something stays the same over the time. Now, it's not enough when it comes to continuity to think, oh, it stayed the same because I don't know any different. In order for it to be continuity, you need to know that it has actively stayed the same. So an event, right, that we might experience soon if we're not going into employment or into a higher apprenticeship or something like that, might be the experience of university life. Now, the change of the experience of university life has been, or will be, as you may find out, is that technology is increasingly used and is fundamentally changing the way that education at university level is being delivered. If nothing else, COVID-19 has forced that to happen. Whilst the continuity, something that's actively stayed the same throughout, is that there is always that shared experience of being somewhere new and that sense of moving forward with life at the same time. And we actively know that that's the same because you can speak to people at university and they'll say exactly the same sorts of thing as well. And I can hear in the back of your minds or back in your brains, you're saying, but it's far more complex than that for history A level. And you're right, it's coming again. It is more complex, but the idea, the principle still stands. So change and continuity usually refer to attitudes, policies, ideas and experiences that cut across different forms of government, different forms of control. Whether that's talking about the Liberal government or whether that's talking about different administrations in America between 1890 and 1990. So for example, in option 5, changing foreign policy in France 1715 to 1815, again taken word for word from the content in the specification for option 5. What we need to be thinking about instead is to what extent did the Ancien regime, the revolutionary government and Napoleon continue the motive in French foreign policy to secure its natural frontiers to ensure the wider security of the state. You don't need to know everything that there is to possibly know about foreign policy in France between 1715 and 1815. There's a lot to know if you looked at it like that. Instead, you're looking for those changes in foreign policy and those continuities in foreign policy. And so an example of an essay question that exemplifies this, right, from option 1, would be to what extent was social change the most significant development in Wales in the period 1240 to 1284. Looking for you to look at social change, continuities in social change, and what other developments happened during this time period as well. So I want to emphasize that these key concepts are what will help you manage that content, otherwise it becomes too big of a burden. So what I'm going to do now for the next section is I'm going to run through with you suggested tasks of the ways that you could manage this content, right? Ways in which you can apply those key concepts we've just looked at to manage this content and help yourself to prevent yourself from being overburdened by at least 100 years of history covering at least 2 themes. So my first suggested task, right, is to ensure that you are totally familiar with the specification. The exam board have said the suggested essays, suggested assessment materials they provide us as your teachers to assess you now over the next few weeks to gather that evidence for your grade. They've brought that, they'll take that from the WJEC. And so they suggest that they will not ask anything that's not on the specification itself. So the first thing I suggest you do is you find that specification on the WJEC website. So I've got the link here. This presentation will be emailed out to you at the end, and so you'll have the ability to just click on that link. There'll be a couple of links further on which you can just copy and paste in. But you'll need to go to that link and you'll need to search for AS or History A/AS level, right? And you'll see the document you can find here. And you need to make sure you open the one that's titled Specification. Now within that, then if you scroll down to between pages 33 and 52, the key concepts and content for your option will appear, and it'll appear in boxes that look like this. So maybe you've already been given these, or you might be given it in a slightly different context. It maybe might look a little bit different. Your teacher might have broken it down a bit, but nevertheless, by finding it on that website there, you will find the content that the exam board says you need to know, and that any questions they set will be set from that. So that's my first suggested task, and that really is your starting point. Without doing that, you won't necessarily be able to manage that content. You won't necessarily be able to take a step forward in applying that to use that content in any essay or any skills-based assessment. So my second way then to manage this content is to identify which key concept is being looked for with what specific content. So what I suggest you do is I suggest you go over the content of the specification and anything you might have worked on in class that is outside of that specification, and identify which elements are referring to which key concepts. So applying this, cause and consequence, significant individuals, turning points, similarity and difference, change and continuity, which bits apply to which. Now I've got a couple of examples here that hopefully might make it a little bit simpler in your head of what you do, and this is how you can then manage that content. So from option 2, right, I know I've got option 10 here, we'll see it in a second, but option 2, right, there's specific reference in this specification to the Western Rebellion, the Ket Rebellion, and the Wyatt Rebellion. Now they fall into the cause and consequence. You can identify, and that's not about an individual, right? It's not about similarity and difference, it's about a cause and consequence. What were the causes of these rebellions? What were the consequences of these rebellions? And by focusing on that, you can manage this content. Option 5, looking at the Ancien regime in France, Voltaire is specifically mentioned in the specification. Now, he would be a significant individual. It's his significance as an individual you need to focus on, not everything there is to know about Voltaire. Option 10 then, we've got the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Now we can call this a turning point because it is a fundamental change. We could also view it as a cause and consequence, but because it is a fundamental change, after the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, you see a complete change in the way that Russia's ran. We call it a turning point. And so again, by defining it as a turning point, you can use that to manage your content in order to not get bogged down in knowing everything there is to know about the 1917 revolution. The Cult of Bresnia is another specific mentioned in the content of, or the specification of option 10. Now this would fall into that similarity and difference because you would compare it to the cults of personality around the Tsar and around Stalin as well. So therefore, if you're ensuring you focus on these key concepts, then crucially you're not wasting time and you're not overburdening yourself by knowing every detail about every event, because frankly, that would be impossible to know it about that minimum 100-year time period. So I suggest you go through and you identify those different elements, and then you go onto the WJEC website, you've got a link here, and you can check them against it, because they have categorized for you what bit of the specification fits into which of these key concepts. My third suggested way of managing this content is to be familiar with all key terminology. These key terms help you to show off your understanding of the area that you've been studying. So I firmly suggest what you do is you make a list of all key terminology you've come across. Now, these are words or phrases that you wouldn't have known if you hadn't studied this topic, and then ensure that you can define them all. So for example, with option 9, these are the key terms: Weltpolitik, Volksgemeinschaft, autarky, denazification, the Bundesstaat, Führerprinzip, the Berlin blockade, all things you may have no idea what they were without studying this specific option. Yeah, you might know what social democracy was if you're doing government and politics A-level as well, for example, but lots of these terms you wouldn't know without doing this study. And so by defining them, you have got those key terms that you can use in any exam, but also you're limiting how much content you need to know, because you don't then need to know everything about everything there is across this time period. Another way I'm going to suggest that you manage the content is by ensuring you're aware of your own understanding and your own weaknesses. And for this, what I suggest you do is you RAG rate each element of the content by highlighting them, in red, amber, and green. Red, you don't understand that content or that concept. Amber, you kind of understand the content and the concept. Green, you do understand it. And use this in order to help yourself, because if you've got it as green, then you know it's not something you need to focus your preparation for any assessment or evidence gathering. It's not something you need to revisit in as much detail as those you've got in amber and red. And remember, you are now doing this from the perspective of that concept you've identified it as, whether that was changing continuity, whether that was a significant individual, and not if you understand everything there is to possibly understand about that event or person. For example, the impact of Jim Crow laws and erosion of black freedom up there, it's not about whether I know everything there is to possibly know about Jim Crow laws and erosion of black freedom, but whether or not I'm aware of the causes and the consequences of these different laws. The fifth way I suggest that you manage this content is by using linking activities. Linking activities are very beneficial in allowing you to contextualize the content and to make sure that you are viewing this as one big interconnected story. And if you view it as one big interconnected story, you don't become overburdened with trying to understand each event in isolation and then getting bogged down in all that detail. So what I suggest you do is you create a linked mind map based around a certain sub-time frame, a key concept, or a certain area. And the two examples I've created for this are as follows, right? In terms of poverty, protest, and rebellion, you could look at all the elements in that theme 1, that was cause and consequence, the poor law, the role of the church, later poor laws, enclosures, and estate management, and the poor law of 1601. Space them out as you've got them here. Start then by using your knowledge, without looking at any notes, to expand and explain the cause and consequence of each of those. Then use your revision, the work you have done, to add to those explanations, but then most crucially of all, highlight the links between each event by drawing an arrow between the two and write on the arrow what the link is, or links I should say plural. And by doing that, you're seeing this as a big interconnected event. How do the poor laws of 1495 influence the addition of the poor laws in 1531 and 1536? Are there similar causes? Are there similar consequences of these laws? So an example, right? An essay question that exemplifies this: the most significant cause of poverty and vagrancy in the period 1509 to 1553 was enclosures. So this question specifically asking you to look at the causes of poverty. By looking at the specific cause and events content in the specification, you can do that. Now, one little thing I would just remind you of here is that in this question it is 1509 to 1553, so the cause and consequence of the poor law of 1601 would not be relevant to that question because it's outside the time frame of that question. But nevertheless, an activity like this will really help you build your understanding of how to answer that question and answer it as it's looking for the cause of that. A second example could be this in terms of parliamentary reform and protest, looking at the key terminology in theme 2. Right? Key terminology in this could be Luddism, Chartism, Paul, the French Revolution. Now again, use your own knowledge to explain each key term, define each key term, then use your revision notes, your work to add to that definition before again creating those links, drawing an arrow between the two that link and writing on that arrow what those links are. And it helps tie it all together and help you answer these questions. Another way I suggest you manage this content is that you use comparison tasks to help you directly compare. So, for example, for each turning point or significant individual highlighted in the specification or that you've studied, then you could draw up the following. Now, remember that a turning point is one at which there is a clear and fundamental change. By using these little graphs here, you can directly compare. So I've given an example here for turning points, right? Turning points with reference to option 3, the publication of the 95 Theses and the diet of worms in 1521. Now, I could be saying that I felt the publication of the 95 Theses had a significant impact, not a major impact, significant impact, but yet the diet of worms had a greater impact. And what I'd suggest you do then, because you'll be able to have this PowerPoint, you can take this, you can make it bigger and use it in these boxes here, then explain why you have given it that kind of scale of impact. And that explanation is what will take you from assertion to an argument. An argument is what they want to see. This is an essay question that exemplifies it. How far do you agree that the publication of Martin Luther's 95 Theses was a major turning point in religion in the period 1500 to 1600s? So by doing an activity like this, you are directly comparing in preparation, and as a result, you will then explain it and you'll be able to be better prepared to answer that essay question. Similarly, for significant individuals, right? Here I've got an example, again from option 3. Significant individuals mentioned in option 3, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, I hope I said that right, and Martin Luther himself. Again, making that comparison, ensuring I explain, because a question, all these questions are directly from past papers that have been for this unit. How far was John Calvin the most significant influence on the spread of Protestantism between 1521 and 1559? You could use this comparison of those significant individuals to create a better answer to that 30-mark essay question. And my final suggested task is that you will have been taught this unit thematically. My students will have been taught it thematically. You will have almost certainly done as well, and not necessarily chronologically. It won't have been looked at that you're doing one event after event after event, following it in time order. So a key way then to make sense of this in your mind is to create a timeline, right? Timeline of events, and this is crucial to understanding and to genuinely understanding the context of each item. So, for example, with this theme 1 here on the French Revolution, okay, the impact, the people as citizens. Now, if we just look at the people as citizens between 1789 and 1799, we might not understand the context because we've looked at it thematically, might not necessarily understand the context of the nature of society earlier on, those 3 estates. You might not understand it in terms of their role of the sans-culottes and their call for citizenship as well. So by drawing it out into a timeline, you get to understand the context of these. Now, as I said, this PowerPoint will be emailed out to you, and so you'll be able to directly apply these different tasks. You'll be able to directly apply it to your specific unit, your specific option, and use it then as a tool to help you. So just a reminder then, our next session is next Tuesday. That's for myself, looking at essay writing and developing a reason argument. The 2 Tuesdays following then will be with Miss Thomas, looking specifically at Unit 4. Thank you very much for your time this evening. I must admit, I said I'd be 30 minutes, just a bit more. I didn't realise I'd be 38 minutes. But in these couple of minutes that are left, what I'd like to do is, if you've got any questions, then please ask them in the side, and I will happily answer them to the best of my ability. So we had one question from Rebecca that, yeah, absolutely, these sessions are recorded and they'll be sent to you just along with these PowerPoints so that you can refer to it. I appreciate maybe I was going fairly fast, so we can get it in without 40 minutes and then you can watch it again at your leisure. Are there any other questions? Okay, just one quick thing then in terms of what my students say to me. They say that this is, and I understand that this content is huge, and just by applying these tasks, these ideas, you can start to manage that content, which will be really important for just making sure it's not too big a burden for you, right? So try your best to kind of try and apply some of these tasks, and that will really help you in making sure that it's not masses and masses of content. In that case, I think there's no more questions have come in. I think, and we are on 10 minutes past. Thank you very, very much for coming. Well done for taking time out of your evening to come. Much appreciated, and all the very, very best in the next week of work before we see each other again next week.
Thank you, Mr. Morell, for your presentation today. Mr. Morell will continue to look at Unit 3 in next week's session on Tuesday, the 9th of March at the same time of 4:30 to 5:10. We hope you can join us again. Thank you very much.